We have additional diplomats and guests that are with us today as part of our 6th annual Diplomacy Day. Shortly, we'll have a slide on the screen that provides an overview of those with that focus. At this time, I want to recognize several of the official consular diplomats posted here in Seattle. And from the left side of your slide, we have, and all of these, by the way, are career officials from their country with multiple assignments abroad, and they are all posted officially here in Seattle. The first one on our list is Ms. Katalin Perman. She's the Honorary Consul of Hungary and President of the Consular Association of Washington. Mr. Hisao Inagaki, Consul General of Japan, and also one of our club members. Ms. Maki Kawamura, Senior Consul at the Consulate General of Japan. Mr. Héctor Iván Godoy Priske, Head Consul of Mexico. Ms. Mia Yen, Consul General of Canada. Mr. Jérôme Pischella, Consul and Senior Trade Commissioner at Consulate General of Canada. Ms. Claudia Gatica de Moreno, Consul General de Guatemala. On the right side, you see several other individuals with senior responsibilities in diplomacy here in the area. I ask you to please make note of them. We have an additional slide with the names of some U.S. Department of Commerce folks who are joining us from Washington, D.C. Of course, trade, commerce, and economic activity are among the high important activities that our consular corps monitor and promote here in Seattle. Please join me in a virtual round of applause for the Diplomacy Roundtable guests. I mentioned earlier that today is our 6th annual Diplomacy Day program. Now I'd like to introduce club member and Diplomacy Roundtable co-chair, Skip Roland, with a classification of Leadership Development, who will introduce that part of our program. Skip and I first became acquainted over 10 years ago in promoting military veterans for key jobs based on their demonstrated skills and abilities. Since then, I've begun to understand the reach of leadership that Skip has throughout our community. Skip, the podium is yours.
Thank you very much, General Collins. Good afternoon, my fellow Rotarians. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the good work of General Collins in inspiring leadership and inspiring hope in our club. Sir, we salute you and we follow your leadership with dedication. Today, thank you, sir. I recognize fellow Rotarians, Diplomatic Roundtable, Blue Ribbon panel members, invited guests, family, and friends. Welcome. The Seattle Rotary Diplomacy Roundtable is celebrating its 6th year of partnership with the Consular Association of Washington and our first collaborative presentation with the United States Department of Commerce. Much thanks go to Ms. Diane Mooney for helping our founder, David Woodward, put this program together. We are collaborating today to provide a program highlighting the soft power of diplomacy to enhance the quality of life of residents of our region and around the world. Today's program, entitled Diplomatic Perspectives on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement Going Forward, features 3 distinguished panelists representing those 3 countries. They will pull back the curtain for us as the United States prepares to open its borders on November 8th and our 3 countries reintegrate more fully. It is a distinct honor for our club's Diplomacy Roundtable to announce that the Honorable Mr. Héctor Iván Godoy Priske, Head Consul at the Consul General of Mexico in Seattle, has accepted our invitation to join the Diplomacy Roundtable Blue Ribbon panel, which represents the senior diplomatic leadership in our region. Thank you, sir, for joining us. And now it is my honor to turn the podium over to my colleague and our founder, the great, the Honorable David Woodward. David, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Skip. Love your intros. So just to recap, the title of this session is Diplomatic Perspectives on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement Going Forward. And our panelists today are Héctor, Iván, Godoy, Priske, Head Consul at Consulate General of Mexico in Seattle, as announced earlier, and Mr. Jérôme Pischella, Consul and Senior Trade Commissioner at Consulate General of Canada in Seattle, and Mr. Alex Tercero Chacón, Mexico Desk Officer at U.S. Department of Commerce, Washington, D.C. Thank you for all for joining us today. Just a very brief comment. The USMCA, U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which replaced NAFTA, went into effect on July 1, 2020, in the middle of the pandemic. 15 months later, the U.S. will soon reopen its borders. So my first question to the three of you, starting with Héctor, is how are the three countries in this agreement viewing the further implementation of the agreement and the challenges and opportunities ahead? Héctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to say it's an honor to be here with the Rotary Club. And Dr. Roland, that was a fantastic introduction as well. And thank you very much, Mr. David Woodward, for the invitation and allowing us to participate today. The idea of where we are with the USMCA is in some ways, I think we all agree that the USMCA was catching up with the realities on the ground. So what we mean by that is much like NAFTA, when NAFTA was implemented, the movement between peoples and commerce between all three of our nations had already been growing considerably. This was a way for us to actualize and really make official some of the realities on the ground. In the case of the USMCA, we view the USMCA as a further entrenching of the idea of North America and North American economic integration in particular. When we think about the USMCA, I think it's important to consider that the USMCA is just the official name for something that was already happening. I mean, when we think about the millions of Mexicans that reside in the United States, but what tends to be a part that's left out in that is that there is 1.5 million Americans currently residing in Mexico. And immigration from the United States to Mexico is constantly growing to the point that at this moment, anywhere between 85% to 90% of all international immigrants to Mexico are from the United States. So we're seeing an incredible moment where North America is becoming a more real concept. And that's what the USMCA is making official what we're already all doing. Thank you.
All right, let's turn it to Jérôme from the Canada perspective.
Thank you, David. First and foremost, it's always a pleasure to speak with Rotarians, and I do hope that we'll have a great conversation. And any questions, like I see one in the chat, I'll be happy to answer. So Héctor is absolutely right, and I fully agree with everything he said. If we look at the USMCA, and Len, your question is, what is the difference between NAFTA and USMCA? The USMCA is essentially the modernization of NAFTA. NAFTA as a trade agreement was signed in 1994. And some of you, I assume, were already born in 1994. We know that society has evolved. The economy has evolved. We've got new ways of doing business, and we had not, as countries, taken the time to sit down, consult with the industry, go to the table, and modernize NAFTA, turning it into what is now USMCA. The economies of our three countries are extremely integrated. Our supply chains are fully integrated, and we wanted to keep that and to keep it working well, not knowing that a pandemic was going to hit us. And really put those supply chains to the test. And I'm glad to see how our economy is doing now. We're working on what's called the roadmap to recovery, which is truly trying to get a North American trilateral integrated economy so that we can be competitive globally and we can be resilient. Len, I hope that answered your question.
Anything else you would like to add, Jérôme, from sort of the national perspective before we turn it to Alex?
Well, what I'd like to say, what Rotarians may not know is that Canada and Mexico are the biggest trading partners of the United States. If you take Canada, for instance, we buy more from the US than China, South Korea, and the United Kingdom combined. We're your first client. And depending on which state you're talking about, Canada is either the first, the second, or the third trading partner, never less than that. So that's really important. We're friends, we're allies, we're partners in trade, in defense, in the fight against climate change, in getting access to secure energy, in values like diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're there together. We've got the largest undefended border in the world, which will reopen on November 8th, as mentioned before. And so we make things together, and we make great things together. And I'm really honored to have my Mexican counterpart here on the call, because we want everyone to realize that our three countries are stronger together, and we'll hopefully keep working together.
Thank you, Jérôme. That's well said. Alex, love to hear your perspective from way over there in the other Washington.
Hello, everyone. David, could you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, good afternoon from Washington, D.C. As David mentioned, it's a pleasure to be part of this panel with representatives from the Canadian and Mexican governments. Pleasure. I would like to thank the Rotary Club of Seattle for organizing this event. Special thanks to you, David, and to Executive Director Caroline Bobinik and Fiona Ronier for their work on logistics and planning of this event. As David noted, my name is Alex Tercero Chacón, and I'm a Mexico Desk Officer here at ITA at the Department of Commerce. I would like to start by noting how important implementation for USMCA was, especially now as we're past a year of entry into force. Commerce coordinated outreach with USTR in the White House, and our efforts led to over 150 USMCA events that we participated in, which covered 34 states, including DC and 66 cities. I think it's important to note that ITA really did conduct outreach to educate the business community on how to comply with the agreement. We launched a USMCA website, which everyone can go to. It's trade.gov/USMCA in May of 2020 to provide stakeholders with detailed information about the agreement and how to comply. As Jérôme and Héctor noted, USMCA is the modernization of NAFTA. I think it's important to note, as Jérôme noted, that Canada and Mexico continue to be the US top trading partners. Over $500 billion worth of goods have been traded for each country respectively. But for USMCA, I would like to kind of highlight real quick the important new chapters and commitments that weren't included in NAFTA, which are included now. First, there's the good regulatory practices. In the USMCA, there's a chapter focused on good regulatory practices, a first of its kind for any US trade agreement, which will help to reduce and prevent non-tariff barriers through a US trade agreement and increase transparency and coordination. Second is digital trade. For digital trade, USMCA prohibits the application of customs and duties and other discriminatory measures to digital products distributed electronically, such as videos, music, software, and games. USMCA ensures that data can be transferred across borders and helps facilitate digital transactions by permitting the use of electronic authentication and signatures. Regarding SMEs, which I know is a big part of this country, for the first time in any USFTA, the USMCA includes a standalone chapter on SMEs. The chapter promotes cooperation among the parties to increase SME trade and investment opportunities, and establishes information sharing tools that will help SMEs better understand the benefits of the agreement. It also establishes a committee on SME issues comprised of government officials from each country. What's very unique about USMCA is that there's an environment and labor chapter. For the environment, the USMCA brings the environment obligations into the core of the agreement. It makes these the obligations enforceable, which focus on combating trafficking in wildlife, timber, and fish. And USTR has a lot of funding in terms of outreach events for folks around the country. On labor, there's a labor chapter which focuses on bringing on labor obligations into the core of the agreement. It requires parties to adopt and maintain labor rights as recognized by the ILO, or International Labor Organization, and obligates parties to address violence against workers. I think to answer your question more about where does this lead us in the future, I think as folks noted, USMCA sets a precedent for a lot of things. And right now we're working on the high level economic dialogue, which my colleagues here at Commerce have been working very closely with our state and USTR colleagues. If you guys understand, but on September 9, the United States and Mexico relaunched the U.S.-Mexico High-Level Economic Dialogue, or HLED. It's a cabinet-level dialogue that meets annually and provides strategic, measurable, and goal-oriented platform to discuss issues that that everyone's been mentioning, as my colleagues just mentioned. It's co-chaired by Secretary of Commerce, Secretary Raimondo, by State Anthony Blinken, and by the U.S. TR Ambassador Catherine Tai. And the meeting, which was held on September 9, was actually opened by Vice President Harris, who set the pace and tone for the pillars which were agreed upon on that day, which were building back together, focusing on supply chains. Pillar 2, promoting sustainable economic and social development in Southern Mexico and Central America, which addresses the root causes of migration, which include joint development programs in Mexico. And Pillar 3, which focuses on securing tools for future prosperity, focusing on regulatory compatibility and risk mitigation, especially in the realm of cybersecurity, networks, telecom infrastructure, and investing in our people, which is Pillar 4, focusing on investing on technical programs for all of workers here in Mexico and the US. And as Jérôme mentioned, on the Canada side, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau launched the US-Canada Partnership Roadmap to address priorities of mutual concern, which include COVID-19, inclusive economic recovery, climate change and clean energy, security and defense, diversity and inclusion, and partnering on global issues. So I think the USMCA, along with all these other bilateral initiatives between Mexico and the US and Canada, it's a good way moving forward.
Thank you for that fabulous overview, Alex, from the U.S. point of view. And I think that it'd be great if, we always say politics is local and diplomacy is local too. So I'm going to turn it back over to Héctor, and I'd love your perspective on the Pacific Northwest in particular. All of us who are based here, we're kind of part of this. We hear about these things, we're like, well, it's these big abstract things, but for the region, what are your thoughts on, and from the Mexican perspective, what are your thoughts on how this affects us here?
Well, I think what's interesting about the Pacific Northwest is, as a region, often when we talk with industry, there's a general sense that Mexico is very far away, which is a surprise because Asia does not appear to be very far away for the Pacific Northwest. So there's a lot of potential in trade between the Pacific Northwest and Mexico. Mexico, because of its geographical region, realistically, it's very close to California and Texas and those states, which means that trade tends to be very, very well integrated in those areas. However, trade with the Pacific Northwest has been growing, and so has the movement of people. I mean, during the COVID pandemic, it was Mexican and Mexican American workers who truly were helping get past some of the worst of COVID by doing some of the very important frontline work that was being done here. Whether it was agricultural workers, nurses, and doctors, it was the Mexican and Mexican American community that was assisting Washington as a whole, because they are part of the Pacific Northwest. We're talking there's close to about 1 million Hispanic residents here in Washington State, and of those, a very significant percentage of about 73% are Mexican or of Mexican descent. Which means that when we think about the USMCA, when we think about the closeness of Mexico and the Pacific Northwest, we have to think about it in terms of potential. And that's what we have seen. What we have seen during COVID, and even before COVID, has been that there have been new flashpoints in trade all throughout the world. And one of them is the Asia Pacific region. What this means for us is that it has shifted some of the thinking from oh, we just happen to be neighbors, to having to restructure this idea of North America and rebuilding, or no, rather than rebuilding, building the concept of North America and the importance of establishing a strong North America. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we are still working on making sure that that's happening because, again, because of geographic closeness and the fact that Canada is that third very important pillar of the USMCA, there's that instantaneous partnership between Canada and the Pacific Northwest. And what we're trying to do now, I think what's very important to keep in mind is that now we have to point out that Mexico has many of the advantages that Asia has, but it also is part of this USMCA agreement, an agreement that has certain guarantees that no other agreement has, such as digital property rights. So that it's this form of thinking, it's rebuilding or building this concept of North America that I think it's very important here in the Pacific Northwest, and the concept of, well, as my friends here have said, we're stronger together, and building up together is going to create a region that's strong for it creates a basic foundation from where we can pursue other policy priorities. And these policy priorities are all over the place. We can meet these challenges of the future together.
That's really an interesting perspective vis-a-vis Asia, and how we have to start rethinking a little bit about what is close and what isn't close. Jérôme, would you like to weigh in on this?
Absolutely. The first thing I would say, David, responding to what Héctor said, I don't think Canada is the third important pillar. I think we're the first.
I knew you were going to do that. That's great.
I misspoke, Jérôme. I misspoke.
I'm kidding. You know that, Héctor. So in our case, with the Pacific Northwest, obviously because of geographic reasons and cultural reasons, the reality is different than for our Mexican friends. If you take Washington State alone, there are nearly 400 companies that are operating in the state that are Canadian-owned. And that's in every single sector you can think of, from heavy machinery to tech. That's an estimated 21,000 jobs. That's 1.3 billion US dollars in salaries. So relationship is definitely there. What's going to happen in the future and post-USMCA and hopefully touch wood post-pandemic, what I'm curious about is the impact on supply chains. Supply chains traditionally between Canada and the US have been vertical, so they've been north to south. In other words, if you were a company from British Columbia, you would be looking at a trading partner in Washington State or Oregon, but you might not be looking at a partner in New York State, whereby if you are the eastern side of Canada, that's where you'd be looking at eastern states. What I've witnessed over the past year and a half, because communications have become virtual, doing business in a way has become more complex because of logistics, but B, easier because, well, we're all on Zoom, we're all communicating right now. So I've seen a large influx and interest of companies from other parts of Canada, not British Columbia, not Alberta, looking at doing business in Washington State. And conversely, we've seen companies from Washington State looking at other parts of Canada. And I'm very curious to see if that's going to hold and the impact that it will have. I think it will enhance even further our economic collaboration, but we'll probably need a few years in order to be able to assess that. One thing which Héctor said, which really resonates with us as well, is the concept of North America as a trading bloc. And I've seen inklings of what's called reshoring, i.e. companies either in Canada or in the US that were sourcing a lot of their products from other parts of the world, mainly from Asia, and that have seen issues with their supply chains. There are still issues right now in vast majority of ports on the West Coast. And so therefore they're looking at opportunities to find new partners, new suppliers, either in Canada or in Mexico. Even though the price might be a bit more expensive, but they have real, sorry, I'm stuttering. They're more reliable, which is really important in business. Last point I'm going to make, if you're wondering about all those Canadian-owned companies and what sectors in Washington State are really important between Canada and the US, we're talking, of course, aerospace, but way beyond that, you're talking about every single aspect of tech. You're talking about marine technology, you're talking about life science, and you're talking about clean technology. And one thing you may not know is that during the height of the pandemic, a lot of the PPEs that were produced in the United States were using raw material from British Columbia. So on every single aspect, we are together.
That's really interesting insights. There's so much we often are unaware of in terms of how global trade works. A lot of myths and misunderstandings, so it's really helpful. Alex, again, could you give us from DC the perspective on the Pacific Northwest and its role?
Absolutely. And apologies, my bandwidth is very low. So if I'm just confirming if you can hear me clearly.
We're okay. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. So to answer that question, here at the Department of Commerce, both our Canadian desk officers and Mexican desk officers, we've been working hard and reaching out to our counterparts. For us here at the Mexico desk, working with Economia, with with the Secretary Cloutier and the Undersecretary de la Mora. In our Canadian desk officer side, having meetings with Minister Ng as well, and the other counterparts as well. But I think from based on the research that I've done with Seattle, Canada is the biggest export market and importer of the Seattle and Washington area. And Héctor, I did read your piece on the high-level economic dialogue from Seattle Times a few weeks ago. And, I think you make some valid points about, having Mexico also play a big role in Seattle. I think that's something important. But when I look at the USMCA and the modernization of the free trade agreement, as I mentioned, the differences in the chapters and the inclusion on the various topics that I covered, I think it really does benefit the Seattle area. When I look at the biggest sectors, which are agriculture, transportation equipment, computer and electronic products, food products, and machinery. We have the chapters on good regulatory practices, digital trade, SMEs. These chapters are here to help exporters and help these companies in the area, in the Pacific Northwest. And I also would like to kind of, plug our resources in the area. As you mentioned, Diane Mooney from our U.S. Commercial Service Export Assistance Center in Seattle. She is a great resource for folks who have questions on how to, engage with these countries and export as well. Thank you.
Thanks for that softball, Alex. I've never told this to any Rotary buddies, but I work with Diane as a volunteer. I just became recently the chair of the District Export Council for the state of Washington. So I might as well come out of the closet and tell you all that. But I'm not getting paid anything for this. So the idea was that, hey, let's bring the U.S. Commercial Service into this conversation because, of course, economics is as critical to diplomacy as anything else. And I think it helps our club understand that how these things are all integrated together rather than in silos. I noticed that Bob Alexander had a question about the environmental provisions. I think that's been addressed, but did any of you want to take that up in terms of the Northwest and anything else to say on that before we wrap up?
I think I'll let probably Alex might be better placed because my hunch is that you're very technical, Alex, whereas I'm more of a generalist on that. So I'll let you answer.
No worries. So the question reads, could you discuss the environment provisions of the USMCA? Is improving the environment any part of the treaty? As I mentioned, the environment has its own chapter in the USMCA, and I'm actually part of the subcommittee, the interagency subcommittee on environment enforcement and monitoring that's led by USTR. A lot of the issues discussed in this committee have to do with information that that's publicly available, but any issues involving fishery issues or potential damage of vulnerable species of animals such as turtles, whales, that's something all three parties have agreed on enforcing, monitoring and enforcing any issues that could potentially arise and discussing these issues. So I think since the implementation of USMCA last year on July 1st, 2020, there's been several cases that have been raised both from the Canadian side and Mexican side, and the committee has reviewed these issues as well. So yes, it is an important part of the USMCA, and it's something that all three parties are discussing and trying to move forward. Yes.
I would love to give everybody a chance to do a quick wrap up. We got about a minute left. So Héctor, any final comments from you?
What I'd like to say is that the USMCA is an update of where we were before. It's an acknowledgement of how far we've come. Mexico, Canada, and the United States are truly in this together. We live together. We share a bloc. We have many of the same priorities. We are republics and democracies. republics and democracies in the case of our friend, of our northern friends as well. All I would like to say is that it's important that we start thinking of how we interact with the world together as well. It's together that we can have a greater impact. And it's sort of, sometimes we all take for granted how friendly of a region this is, how friendly North America is, and what that means for our industries and commerce going forward.
That's beautifully said. I think we'll stop there. Our time is up, and also Jérôme, Alex, Héctor, thank you all for being with us today. I hope that you'll be available to bring you back in the future for further conversation. This is just a starting point, and we're also very happy that Consul General Yen is just here now for Canada, and she's on the call, her first public event here in Seattle. So thank you, Consul General Yen of Canada, for joining us today. We are really appreciative of all of you public officials supporting our efforts in Rotary to engage globally. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you,
for
everyone.
having.
Appreciate
Thank you
it.
so much for having us.
And if
David?
I just make very quick comment, if I may, Diane Mooney is fantastic. If you know companies that want to do business in Canada, so is my staff. So use the consulate. Whatever you might need, we're here for you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for the plug. That's great.
All right, David, guests, thank you all so very much for bringing this conversation to our club today. We appreciate it more than you know. It just sounds more positive than I think we read. So this is awesome. Thank you. All right, let's get on with some thanks. Big shout out to Liz Powell and our good friend Bob Alexander for always stepping up and being our gold sponsors every month. Because of them, we're allowed to watch conversations like today's back on our own YouTube channel.